Welcome to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, hosting insightful conversations with fascinating people to shape the way that Britain interacts with the world. Welcome to the first episode of Series 3. I'm your host, Anna Joy Rickard, and in this episode, I talk to journalist and writer Jonn Elledge about his new book, A History of the World in 47 Borders, the stories behind the lines on our maps. We discuss a number of these stories that help us understand the world today, as well as chewing over British history and how we interact with it. Welcome, Jonn. It's an absolute privilege to have you on this podcast, and you're here to talk about your new book, which I will find here to hold up. Could you introduce yourself and tell us about the book?
Sure. I'm glad you had a copy to hold up, because I suddenly realised all my copies are currently propping up my laptop so I can do this interview, which feels like a metaphor for something. So my name is Jonn Elledge. I'm a journalist and author. I'm a columnist at the New Statesman. Write a lot for various other places like CapX and The Guardian. This is my third book. It's called A History of the World in 47 Borders, the stories behind the lines on our maps. And it is little essays on borders and other lines on maps, starting in ancient Egypt and working all the way through history to the borders of space.
Yeah, and I was genuinely excited when I saw this book, and that is because when you talk about foreign affairs, and obviously on this podcast we're having a lot of conversations about current state of play of countries and their relationships between each other, but you just can't get away from this border issue in many situations, can you? And having worked a lot in the African continent as well, you know that it's very present and it's very much part of our history, but something that I don't think we actually often know much about. You know, you almost find things out by Googling on Wikipedia sometimes, and yet these are profound origin stories of where some things come from. And so the other thing I love about the book is short and sweet, right? Your chapters, 47.
Yeah, they're about 5 or 6 pages each, which is often that was quite a good length. It's because they're like little. I'm a journalist. They're like little features.
Yeah.
But it does mean there are a couple of the biggest stories where I was very aware of, like squeezing stories which people have written, multi-volume books about into 2,500 words. But also that does give you a certain amount of leeway, because I'm not a historian. I'm kind of an interested amateur. So it kind of gives me a get out clause when people say, "Oh, you didn't cover this." It's like, "Oh, well, I didn't have much space, I'm afraid."
It's like the bird's eye view, isn't it? That you can sort of zoom in and out of, which makes it very compelling. This book obviously has a whole set of stories, fascinating insights that cover countries right across the world, all sorts of regions, and like you said, different parts of history. I'm interested for you to tell us a few that help us understand British history, either Britain or Britain's involvement in the world.
So one of the sort of recurring themes of the book is empire, obviously. I think we do sometimes talk about it as if empire is a thing invented by the British in about 1750, when obviously it is a longer standing and in some ways a more natural form of government than the nation state, which is a relatively modern invention. But nonetheless, like the European empires, and specifically the British one, did do a lot to kind of shape the world we live in today. So there are numerous essays in the book concerning things that I was vaguely aware of, but I didn't know the details of until I researched them. Like, exactly what happened with the partition of India, and to what extent was British policy culpable for the I think millions of deaths that followed that. Or like, actually probably the one I that's closest to home, which I was most shamed by my ignorance of, is I didn't really know about the history of Britain and Ireland. I mean, obviously I knew there had been one, from. And I knew that, it had not been a particularly noble history, and there have been a certain amount of atrocities. But I never before actually kind of sat down and looked into the details and understood exactly what was going on, exactly why Cromwell is such a hate figure, for example, in Ireland, or what the Protestant ascendancy was, or how it was we ended up with a border around 6 counties in Ulster that remained in the United Kingdom. And I do think all these things are these are basic pieces of information about both why this country is the way it is, but also about why we are perceived the way we are elsewhere in the world. And we are not taught about the empire in schools to any great extent, I think. There is an inherent imbalance in that, like, if we stick with Ireland as an example, like the relationship with Britain is obviously, the big theme in Irish history. The relationship with Ireland is not the big theme in British history the other way around, because, it was one of a large number of countries there was a sort of colonial relationship with, and there was a lot of other stuff going on as well. So I think, I think, from a foreign policy perspective, I think often we probably don't understand exactly why we are perceived the way we are perceived, and that can no doubt be unhelpful.
Yeah, unpack it for us a bit. Unpack a little bit what you found. I'm thinking there'll be people listening to the podcast who will note, I want to read that book. I will go and read that chapter eventually. But it might be a while. And so just a little bit more around what was in that chapter.
Sure.
And why it taught you the things you've just noticed.
So Ireland, I think, is the only one I actually ended up doing 2 chapters on in the end, because I did one that's basically the story up to about 1700s, and one of the sort of more modern history explaining why the border on the island of Ireland exists. One of the things that I hadn't sort of grasped until I looked into it is, like, we often, the phrase that is used is, since Henry II, like, that was the first English king to interfere in Irish affairs in 1169, I think it was. But there's a couple of things about that I think kind of get elided by that statement. One of which is, like, he wasn't an English king in the sense that we would later understand it. He was the ruler of an empire across a large chunk of Western France as well. And so it wasn't like, and also his military forces were sort of Anglo-Norman and Welsh. It's like, it wasn't, you can have an argument about whether this was English involvement in Ireland or the force that was occupying England being involved in Ireland. So already the story is more complicated. And also for the first few hundred years, there is obviously, there are English or Welsh settlers over there, but it is more of it's the sort of feudal relationship you get across Europe. I don't think it's that unusual. What really flips is the Reformation, when suddenly, England and also Scotland become Protestant countries, and there are Catholic powers which can be perceived as a threat, most notably Spain and then later France, and it becomes a concern to the rulers of England, Scotland, Britain that there is an Irish, a Catholic country right next door, which could be used as sort of a backdoor. So originally it's a sort of security impulse to kind of like try and convert Ireland and to settle it with English and Scottish settlers. That only comes off in some regions. There's a lot of atrocities that come from that. It's a lot of wars. But that is the plantations, which is how you end up with, a large chunk of Ulster, particularly, being Protestant and English and especially Scottish in origin, which is what several centuries later results in the partition. I hope nothing in there is going to get me cancelled, but that's my sort of very rough understanding of it. But I think it's kind of an interesting story because it does kind of flip from the sort of thing that is happening everywhere to something that becomes much more specific and horrible, and still kind of resonates to this day. And also, another one of the chapters I wrote about Ireland is actually specifically about cartography, because there is this thing called the Down Survey, in which an English surveyor, whose name annoyingly escapes me right now, but basically is commissioned to map the whole of Ireland, specifically to take the land from the Irish people and give it to and give it to English soldiers to pay them for their role in the wars of the 1640s. And the Irish are basically sort of, it is basically ethnic cleansing. Like, the English New Model Army is engaged in ethnic cleansing, trying to push the native Irish population west of the River Shannon. In a moment described in history as like they were sent to hell or to Connaught, to hell being the Caribbean colonies as well. Some of them were transported. And sorry, I'm doing this in kind of garbled fashion, but nonetheless, this is.
I love it.
But all this explains why there is still a lot of anger and resentment in Irish politics towards the history of English-British involvement in Ireland. And I think people on this side of the Irish Sea just don't understand why, because we've not been taught about this history. It's sort of strange that we know so little about it.
Yeah, and I want to come back to this a little bit later on, because I think that's such an important point, isn't it? That when a people or communities or a nation's history is defined in some way by the British, and yet the British do not know that enough, there's not enough public understanding of that. That feeds in, doesn't it? It means diplomats don't necessarily know it. It means that journalists don't know it. It means that anyone advising on foreign policy may not completely be aware. And there is that's a problem for us.
But in the most extreme version, it's like during the Brexit negotiations, in the run up to the referendum, no thought was given to what this would mean for relationships with the Republic of Ireland, what this would mean if it meant we had to have a border, and there was suddenly, a target on the island of Ireland. No, and I think there are people in the United Kingdom who don't understand that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. And there are others who assume the whole of Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. They don't really see it as foreign, but there's kind of very little understanding of where the line is or what the history is that kind of meant it came to be.
And when you talk about lines, there's also a chapter on the British and the French and the Middle East, isn't there?
Oh, the Sykes-Picot, yeah. So the thing I found really striking looking into Sykes-Picot is that was not the agreement that actually sort of got implemented. Like, everyone still refers to the line in the sand, which is broadly the line dividing Iraq on the south from Syria in the north. Everyone still refers to that as Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot actually drew a slightly different line. It was the same rough concept, but it was only one of a bunch of agreements signed at different times between slightly different powers. So, like, the Russians were originally involved because they wanted Constantinople. Then after the revolution, they're not involved, but the Italians are. And so it's like, it's kind of an interesting question to me why Sykes-Picot is the one we remember. And I think to a large extent it's because it has a name. It's got such a good name. Like, and this is a thing that comes up over and over again in the book, is like the Mason-Dixon line is another, or the treaties of Westphalia, where like you just get these sort of names that you have an idea of what they mean, and when you actually dig down into them, they mean something completely different. But yeah, so, Sykes-Picot is obviously, even if that specific line is not the one we got, like the philosophy behind it, and the way that like the Ottoman Empire is divided up between Britain and France after the war, those
after the First World War.
After the First World War, yeah, sorry, those do still kind of shape the map of the Middle East today. And when about 10 years ago, when ISIS, when they were sort of rampaging across the Middle East, one of their policy goals was explicitly to erase Sykes-Picot and unify the territories on either side from both Syria and Iraq. And in fact, it's in the very name, isn't it? Like, ISIS was Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, I think. But yeah, it's like literally their policy goal was to erase, whatever we call it, the line drawn by the British and the French in the aftermath of World War I. So I think, like, to an extent that we perhaps underplay sometimes, because we don't think of ourselves as this kind of great imperial power anymore, because we're a much more middling power than we were. Nonetheless, the map of the world is still very much shaped by the legacy of the European empires.
And important that we know that, and that we pay attention as we follow current affairs. You talked a bit there about some of the British stories and interactions with the world. What about other ones that you came across and thought, oh, we really should know that?
Oh, so one of my favorites, and I think it's sort of an important moment because it's kind of almost, it's the moment where you sort of fire the starting gun on 4 or 5 centuries of European imperialism, is the Treaty of Tordesillas. I can never pronounce Spanish, but the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, which is when the Spanish and Portuguese crowns agreed to draw a line down the middle of the Atlantic and say, right, everything on this side, everything to the west is going to be Spanish, everything to the east is going to be Portuguese. And that has had a number of effects, one of which is the existence of Brazil, which is obviously quite a big state these days, but it explains why when everywhere else in Latin America, well, not quite everywhere, almost everywhere else in South America and Latin America speaks Spanish, Brazil speaks Portuguese. It's because where the line was drawn, it did put the tip of the western tip of South America. No, the eastern tip of South America was on the Portuguese side of the line. So they got a foothold in South America out of this. But also I just find it fascinating. It's like, two European powers who between them, they're not very big at that point. Like, Portugal had a fairly sizable trading empire. Spain was at that point really just Spain, and it was a fairly new state. It has only been unified for a couple of years. Just the gall to kind of like draw a line down a map of the world, get a blessing from the Pope and say, right, we're going to carve this up between us. And I think to some extent, it was an economic impulse, but I think it was also a religious one. It was about spreading Catholicism as well. But it just kind of feels like that's a moment we should know more about, isn't it? Like, just like,
Yeah.
where did the whole idea of Europeans carving up the world come from? I sort of think we should know more about that bit. And another set of chapter I found very interesting to research because of the way it shapes the world. It's not actually about European imperialism at all. It's about the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. But I think that, obviously Genghis Khan and his successors create the largest contiguous world empire, the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. It stretches from basically the Crimea to Korea. It is enormous. And that has all sorts of knock-on effects that are still with us. Firstly, it takes out, for 5 centuries before that, one of the world's great powers has been the Caliphate, which is with its heart in what is now Iraq. But the Islamic world has been kind of a leading, it's a leading center of kind of science and so on. And that's kind of wrecked by the Mongols and never really recovers. It knocks out the sort of leading, what we now call Russian state in that period, is Kiev and Rus. That's kind of knocked out by the Mongols, and it means that power passes to a duchy named Moscow, which, because of everything that happened, is quite a paranoid view of the world. That's still affecting us. It sort of encourages the Chinese to kind of rebuild their walls and hunker down behind them a bit, so they kind of like stop facing the world to the extent they have been in the previous centuries. And because the Mongols never quite reached Western Europe, it means that what was previously a backwater can kind of catch up. And that sort of sets the stage for the European empires as well. And again, I think this is a hugely important moment in world history that we just do not really talk about very much in this country.
Something that's really interesting. So I remember when I went to Mongolia, you get that feeling about that history. You suddenly learn that history, firstly, if you didn't know before. And then you get the feeling, this nation's sense of itself, its identity and its history goes back a long way to a large empire. And it's interesting, I guess, thinking about how countries understand themselves, isn't it? And often the most weight is given to the point in history when they were most powerful, most perhaps cutting edge, forward looking. I don't know. I know in West Africa it's the same, looking back at great civilizations. And that's very important. And so I think that's interesting when we think about our own history learning. Maybe that's why we're so obsessed with the Victorians.
I think so. And also the Tudor period, the 16th century, is kind of very much the foundational moment for the modern English and then British states. But also even our obsession with World War II, I think is at least partly because it's actually the last moment we were a superpower. It's the last moment Britain really matters. And also by telling a story about how, Britain held out against the Nazis, Britain stands alone, and so on, all of which is, slightly propagandistic, but it's not entirely without truth. I think it kind of enables us to kind of picture ourselves as the good guys at the moment where the other thing that was happening is we were about to dismantle the empire. It means we'd never kind of reckoned with the legacy of empire because it's kind of hidden by the story of Britain defeating the Nazis.
Yeah. I was wondering, what about any particular striking stories, funny ones that you uncovered as you went through?
So like if we're moving on to safer ground, where I can make jokes about silly stories. That's lovely. I prefer this.
Not for long. I'm coming back.
Oh God. I'm just very aware that, going back to what I was saying about all these are quite short essays, I cover a lot of subjects very quickly, and I am not claiming to be an expert in history or foreign policy or anything. I'm basically an informed nerd. I'm an enthusiast for these things.
But it's what makes your book very compelling, like I said, because you really can zoom in, zoom out very quickly, pick it up. 10-minute coffee break, read another thing. Yeah.
So what did I enjoy found it? I think Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, who's kind of waiting to inherit the Austro-Hungarian crown until he's shot by a Serbian nationalist in 1914, and that sets off World War One. Every product of a British school can name Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and probably Gavrilo Princip, the guy who shot him as well. But I don't think we know much about him as a figure. And he was kind of like both the story of how he came to be the heir and his own personality are fascinating. So he only, his uncle was Franz Joseph, the kind of reigning emperor. And Franz Joseph had a son who was a bit of a shagger with mental health problems, and he seemed to have been depressed. And he took his 17-year-old mistress off to a cabin in the woods, murdered her, and then shot himself. So that's the only reason Franz Ferdinand got to be heir in the first place. I feel like that's a story we should know.
The twists and the turns.
Yeah. But also, he had all these sort of interesting ideas for, in some ways, he was quite modern. He sort of wanted to turn the empire into it was called the United States of Greater Austria. So this kind of messy sort of set of territories that speak about a dozen different languages and make up about a dozen European countries today. He was very interested in plans that would have kind of created individual states for German speakers in what became what's the Czech Republic today, or the German Austria. There would have been a Hungarian bit, a Romanian bit, a Slovenian bit, and so on. And it was just kind of an interesting, an alternate history. You can kind of see, well, if he's not shot and that gets implemented, and there is this kind of multicultural federal state in the heart of Europe, you kind of have this a very different European history play out. But also he was a slightly strange man who so much, it's possible he didn't mean any of this. He just really didn't like the Hungarians. And the way the empire was set up, the dual monarchy was the Austrians and the Hungarians were between them dominating everybody else in the empire. And Franz Ferdinand felt this gave too much influence to the Hungarians. So to some extent, probably the kind of devolution plan was actually about undermining the people he didn't like as much as anything else. What else was there? It was kind of interesting on the silly side. I really like the town of Bala in the southern Netherlands, which is quite well known. I think it's the Dutch town that has lots of little packages of Belgium inside it. So it's actually two towns, Siamese twins, Bala Hertog and Bala Nassau. This is all because of some unresolved territorial disputes from the 12th century Holy Roman Empire or something. But nobody's ever kind of ironed them out with land swaps or whatever. So to this day, in a single town, there are some buildings that are Dutch and some that are Belgian. And they have different laws, different licensing regimes. During COVID, there were different sets of rules. So I think I can't remember which way round it was, but one of the citizens of one of these towns came out of lockdown before the other. So there's all sorts of complexities to it. But because, Belgium and the Netherlands are basically quite close, it's never kind of devolved into war. Yeah, it's fine. But, I think that's just kind of a lovely story about how borders don't have to matter, even when, if you don't want them to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then your third, the third section of your book's really interesting because that's about borders that are land borders, isn't it? And
it's the weird ones. Yeah.
but that's Antarctica, maritime borders, airspace, and then you end with space, right? And
Yeah.
just tell us about some of those, because they are very relevant to today's news and current affairs.
So I think the Antarctica stuff is quite interesting because, like, there are a lot of stories in this book that are quite depressing. Like, I make jokes about them, but there's a lot of stories of, like, war and conflict and human stupidity and people starving to death because they're the wrong side of a line and so on. It's the Antarctica one is a story that's actually, like, bordering on inspiring. So for much of the early 20th century, various powers, not all of them European, are making territorial claims on Antarctica. And, some of them overlap, and there's about 7 of them, I think, still extant. And, it looks like it could be another site of, it looks like it could be another site of conflict. But that doesn't happen because, partly I think because the war has happened, World War II has happened and everyone's a bit exhausted. But also I think it was 1958 was designated the International Geophysical Year, which is not, which is, doesn't sound thrilling, but it was basically a scientific thing. The research community kind of, like, all wanted to do a lot of research into solar flares and things. And so, like, there is a sort of great pause in territorial claims so that people can kind of send their scientists down there and they can kind of do their research. And it goes so well that someone, I think it might be the Americans, just basically gets everyone around the table and says, look, why don't we try and hammer out a treaty? And the Antarctic Treaty, it doesn't kind of sort of make anyone renounce their existing claim, but it does kind of limit the enforcement. It reserves Antarctica as basically a nature reserve. Says it's there for all. It's the preserve of all humanity. You can't just start drilling for oil or whatever it is. And it is kind of it's sort of a nice model for, like, what you can do. It's one of the only stories in the book where, like, countries aren't just relentlessly pursuing their own self-interest. And my only slight concern is I think it's up for renegotiation in 2040. And, there must be a concern that with climate change, if we get to a point where large chunks of the Antarctic ice sheet are melting and it becomes possible to drill for oil rather than immensely impractical, is that agreement going to hold? But it is nonetheless, it's quite inspirational compared to most of the stories in the book.
Yeah. And what did you find out about space?
Space is kind of the sort of counterexample in that, like, again, there have been those treaties. Forgive me, I can't remember which order they happen in, but there is definitely a treaty that says basically the same thing about space as the Antarctic Treaty says. It's not the preserve of any individual nation state. It's there for all humanity. Blah blah blah. But then a couple of decades later, there's another treaty. I think this one's the Moon Treaty that says much the same, but is not signed by any of the big powers. I think the biggest power that signs it might be France, but, like, the US, China, Russia do not agree to that treaty. And now we're moving into a world where, like, it's the Artemis Accords is an agreement between the US and various of its allies, which has a lot of stuff about kind of like the zones of interest or whatever it may be, zones of influence on the moon, basically saying, but if you've got a probe up there, you can't go in another country's sort of a bit of the moon. And it's already, you can kind of see, well, firstly, you can kind of see the same kind of territorial imperative starting to play out somewhere that isn't the Earth, which is a little bit bleak. But also, again, that's not been signed by Russia or China. So, like, if they choose not to respect that treaty, what happens? What does that mean?
The positive story was India last year. I know in our wrap up from last year, we did a bit on India's space ambitions and space achievements. And definitely is when people cover geopolitics, they kind of go around the world, they go to the major powers, and then the last chapter or the last section is always space and the Arctic, right? So let's come back to Britain and British history. I love it because I feel like I was going to call you a history expert. You've kept saying you're an amateur history lover, maybe.
I don't want to upset any actual historians. Like my degree is English literature, and I didn't go to that many lectures for that. So
just let's unpack that a little bit more around why is it important for us as a country to understand our history? We've talked about some of the reasons why you would always need to understand if our country is defining somebody else's sense of who they are and what gets missed in that. And we've also mentioned, I mean, the really serious case of the Brexit kind of conversations and discussions and campaigning that just really ignored an enormous impact that another country was going to experience and part of our own nation. But what else, when you think about it, why is this something that we should take seriously?
I think partly because it is important to understand where a polity came from. I think we should probably understand why England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are a single state for good or ill. Like if you want to understand, why the arguments around Scottish independence, I think it's probably worth sort of understanding more of the history stuff. I think this is definitely going to get me in trouble, but I think a certain amount of Scottish nationalist rhetoric is also a little bit historically ignorant. I think there is sometimes an assumption that England basically conquered Scotland when that's not what happened at all. It was very much a decision by the ruling elite in both countries that our interests would be better served together. None of which is to say that Scotland doesn't have a perfect right to independence if it wants it. But I think sometimes there is this assumption that England kind of dragged it into an empire when actually what happened was England and Scotland merged and then built an empire. So I think it's worth understanding in terms of contemporary political debates like that one. But I do also think there is this weird disconnect between how we see ourselves and how the rest of the world sees us. And I think it is worth trying to unpack that a little bit. I was thinking about this a couple of years ago during a football tournament. The 90s Baddiel Skinner Lightning Seed song, Free Lions, the chorus of which is "It's coming home, football coming home." That was perceived around the world as like a mark of English arrogance. Whereas actually, if you listen to the lyrics, it's not that at all. It's a song about failure and longing and hope. So I think there is this kind of disconnect where people still sort of think we act like an arrogant imperial power. And sometimes we do. Sometimes we overestimate ourselves. Sometimes we don't think about our actions in terms of how they'll affect everyone else, as with Brexit. But I think there is also a sense of decline in this country. Like there is a sense that, we used to be a power and now we're this, that I don't think has communicated itself to the rest of the world. I don't think a lot of countries realize quite how depressed this country feels about its place in the world these days. I think we do kind of feel like we've lost a lot of ground, even in the last few years. And I don't think that's very well understood outside our borders.
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of what this podcast kind of vision is, to have those conversations and develop some of that thought leadership around that. But I think you're right. I think it gets quite interesting when those two versions of what is felt inside and what is seen outside get further and further apart, actually, doesn't it? I think something, though, that comes from this of understanding our history more is being able to deal with looking at something that feels and is awkward, uncomfortable. It's not, like you said, the moments when we were winning as such in a perhaps justifiable way. So let's say Second World War, there's a lot of our nation's psyche is attached to that, a lot of our popular culture, etc. And you can follow that story. It's a comfortable place to be as a British person, right? Talking about the Second World War. But there are other parts of our history, and even within wartime as well, that where it's not comfortable, it doesn't feel good. We weren't necessarily on the right side of history, and of course it's easy to shy away from that. I wondered how do you think about things, and how would you recommend people start to get comfortable with our uncomfortable history?
I mean, I think a lot of the conversation about this kind of like reduces it to a story of, goodies and baddies. Were you on the right side of history? Were you on the wrong side of history? And I don't think that's always very helpful. I think actually, like two of the things I did want to kind of make clear in the book is like, there are a lot of things in British history which we probably should not be proud of. But also, I think it is wrong to kind of like suggest that, Britain and its empire were a sort of unique evil. Like, if there were other European empires that also have their own horrible histories, they're not necessarily coming to grips with. And you go further back than that, there were, it's not as if Europeans invented the concept of imperialism either. I think to an extent, Britain was the one that happened to be kind of like holding the torch to the point when the Industrial Revolution happened. So it became, to an extent, like to the extent that our empire and its glories and its crimes were bigger, it's because of the sort of economic revolution as much as anything else. But I think I don't entirely understand why this has to be such an emotional conversation. Like, I think it should be possible to like make an honest accounting that doesn't require us to kind of either sort of pretend that atrocities never happened or to pretend that, we are the worst of the worst. I think there is sometimes it's a column I keep meaning to write about negative patriotism, which you see in Britain, but I think also often in America as well, possibly in other countries I'm less familiar with. But the idea, like, it's instead of being the best nation, it's, oh God, we are the worst. Nobody is as awful as us. And it's like, no, every nation has some fairly horrendous stuff in their history. And I think every nation has like the potential at the very least to be both perpetrator and victim. So like, I think actually Ireland's an interesting example of this because, Ireland was absolutely a case of colonialism on the part of the British. The British troops went over, they committed all sorts of atrocities. There were ethnic cleansing, there were murders, and so on. All these horrible things happened. But you get to the 19th century and Irish administrators are playing a big role in helping run Britain's empire in the rest of the world. It's not a simple story of like, I think it's sometimes funneled in internet discourse into like, well, which side are you on? Are you the good guys or the bad guys? And I think that's just an incredibly unhelpful way of thinking about it. And also a very boring way of thinking about it. Like, real history is far more interesting if you actually try and sort of grapple with like, why things happened, rather than just trying to sort of reduce them to black and white.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, I'd love to see our country progress on this in the next sort of 10 years. My kids are in school. They're learning history pretty much in the same way as we did, right? In the same blocks, in the same kind of framing. But I love that, just about us getting to this stage where we can talk quite freely and easily about where and what the British did, what are different periods of history, how they fitted with other great empires as well, and then able to pick it apart, sometimes even laugh at some of the silly stuff like you said, or the what ifs, or the what did or didn't happen because someone was killed or wasn't, but also reckon with some of it in a way that doesn't take individual guilt, I think.
I mean,
or defensiveness.
I think it should be possible to say, yes, the country of which I am a part was engaged in imperialist expansion and various horrendous historical crimes without thinking that is a personal reflection on you. I was not involved in, I don't know, the partition of India or something. That's not my personal responsibility. So I don't see why it's so hard to say, yes, my country did that.
And there's something really powerful as well, I think, that's happening at the moment around as there's a push to give space for more diverse voices and people from different communities telling stories, shaping how our history is talked about. We're actually getting some really, I mean, it makes me think about it when you think about, talk about the partition stories. We're getting personal family stories come through all over the place in TV and literature, in programs. And these are really amazing ways to learn history, I think, and to reckon with some of the stuff that people may be less aware of but should be.
So like the partition of India is actually a really good one in terms of the recency of a lot of this stuff. Like one of the things I listened to as part of my first round of research on it was there was a fantastic BBC radio documentary series, which I think you can still find on BBC Sounds, for the 50th anniversary of partition, by someone Whitehead. I can't remember his first name, unfortunately. But if you search Whitehead and India partition, you'll find it. And it was from 1997, which is, I was a teenager in 1997, so that feels. Obviously, it's not, but it still feels recent to me. And he talks to a lot of people who were there, who have personal memories of the partition of India in 1947. There's a guy talking about his memory of like what happened in his village as a child and what his mother witnessed as a middle-aged woman at partition. And I was thinking, wow, it's kind of incredible that this guy, this is a personal eyewitness to history. And then they roll his mother on, and she was like 40 when it happened. She's like in her 90s at this point. But like, it's all so recent. Like it's very easy to think
recent.
like, yeah. Or like, and there is also a thing, sorry, I feel like I'm diving in slightly random directions there, but they also, I think you sort of imagine the world you are born into is natural. And so like it kind of hit me in a way it hadn't before, that like the nation of Bangladesh, which has been there my entire life, which I just kind of assume is a permanent feature of the map, had been there for all of 9 years at the point I was born. Like it is not an old nation at all. And I think like it is easy when you grow up with a border to sort of imagine it's as natural a feature of the world as, mountains or seas. And they're not. They're man-made and they can be unmade. And sometimes surprisingly quickly.
Yeah, this this crazy thing about history, that the span of a human life covers an enormous amount of history often, particularly when you're talking about nation states, borders, countries' histories, countries' futures. And I think it's important, that's interesting, you talking about hearing people tell their eyewitness accounts, because it's also important, isn't it, I guess, for us to recognise we're two white people talking about this, aren't we? And there is also deep pain and deep injustice that people have personally suffered who are British, and going on that journey together and learning this history together is really important. I think that is partly what I love about your book. It's so accessible and you can just pick it up. Just to finish off, I mean, you're a British journalist, writer, keen observer, I would say, of the British people. What are your observations about who we are as a nation and our identity as a nation? That I'm asking this to lots of my podcast guests, like national traits and national stories that help us understand who we are as a people, and that are part of our way of finding our way forward in the world.
I mean, I think like a lot of the last at least 10 years of British politics have kind of been about arguing about that, about who we are and where the limits are. And all the culture war stuff and the Brexit stuff is to some extent about two different versions of Britain. Like, are we, imperial glory? Are we the NHS? And the honest truth is we're both. Like, we are a country that's produced. There are a lot of sort of Little Englander types of like quite narrow-minded people, but we are also we can also be very outward-looking. I think there is a danger of like reducing things to national traits. I think a lot of things we could say about the country would also be just as applicable to a lot of other countries I'm less familiar with. I actually think like culturally, I think humour is important. Like I think just in terms of the way we conduct so much of public life and so much of our entertainment, like our great British exports have a lot of jokes in them. I mean, even the ones that are not ostensibly comedies, like Top Gear or Doctor Who, neither of those are kind of comedic programs, but they are. There are a lot of bits that are intended to be funny in them. I think that's an important national trait. I think but I don't want to say like, oh, we don't take ourselves too seriously, because obviously for a lot of history, that's absolutely not the case. We've taken ourselves immensely seriously, which is why we went around the world trying to impose our will on everybody else.
Yeah, no, I agree though. The humour thing I think is fascinating, because it absolutely is something that most British people would mention it. Most people from outside would. I know our French friends say eccentric goes in together with humour as well, right? The quirkiness, this character. I think there's something, as you say, we've been very serious, but there's always the humour element. And what is that? Resilience, the ability to take a step back and observe something about what you're going through. I don't know, but I agree. It's very live.
I do wonder the extent to which this is sort of a function of modern Britain, and it's about like humor is a consolation prize, right? It's like, you know, humor is the way we kind of make ourselves feel better about stuff. So is this a function of decline? Like, I don't feel like rising powers produce such great comedy as falling ones, probably.
I love that. I'm thinking it's also many different ways of conveying humour, and I mean, one of the ways that I think you write so well is you're able to observe, but also be humorous with it, and so your listeners and followers are also seeing that as a way to absorb information, I guess, whilst be entertained.
I think there are a couple of chapters in the book that don't have many jokes in them. Like the partition of India hasn't got many. I don't think the Israel-Palestine one has. It might not have any. But generally speaking, like, my natural instinct is always to be cracking jokes on the page to make it to make the facts I'm trying to convey more entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely. And so finally, I know you've got a popular Substack, you write regularly. Tell people how they can follow you and how to get your book.
So yeah, the Substack is called The Newsletter of Not Quite Everything, which is, I mean, the title was chosen to tie in with my first book, The Compendium of Not Quite Everything, which was very much, it was sort of facts and lists and interesting essays. So it was very much for the sort of Christmas dad present market, to put it that way. But it is just like, there is no rhyme or reason to what I write about, except it's what I happen to fancy writing about. So there is a lot of history on there. There's a certain amount of geography. There's politics. There's internet culture. It is literally just what I'm thinking about this week, and somehow this has worked surprisingly well as a business model. In a way, it has no right to whatsoever. But you can find that at Jonn, which is JONN. John.substack.com. I also am a columnist for my alma mater, the New Statesman, and I write for lots of other places too. I'm inescapable on the internet. And the book again is called A History of the World in 47 Borders, and it is out everywhere you might want to buy a book.
Amazing. Thank you, John. It's been such a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for your time. It's been fun.
Thank you for listening to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, where Britain meets the world. Subscribe today, share it with a friend or colleague, and be part of shaping Britain's role on the global stage.